Masechet Baba Batra, Daf, Kof Lamed Chet. The first topic is someone refusing a gift. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, HaKotev Nechasav La'acher, V'amar Hala I Efshi Bahen Kana, V'afilu Omed V'soveach, V'Rabbi Yochanan Amar Lo Kana. Rav Yehuda, in the name of Shmuel, says that if someone writes a deed of a gift, it means you write down in a shtar, I want to give over to you this field or this animal, and he gives it to the other person, and the other person is saying, I do not want it. I do not want to accept this gift. Let's say it's a pet, and he doesn't want a pet, some item that he has no interest in having. Nevertheless, it is a gift. He acquires it, and even if the recipient is standing and screaming, saying, I don't want this, I don't want this, nevertheless, it goes to him. That's pretty strange. Why should it go to him when he's standing and screaming that he doesn't want it? And indeed, Rabbi Yochanan argues against the first opinion, against Shemuel, and he says, no, he does not acquire it. So Rabbi Yochanan seems to make sense. Let's see if we can make a sense of Shemuel. Amar Rabbi Abba bar Memad vela pelige kan besoveach meikara kan beshotek meikara ulbasof soveach. Rabbi Abba Memad says, actually, Shemuel and Rabbi Yochanan are not even arguing. They're talking about two different cases. Rabbi Yochanan is talking about a case where he was screaming in protest the entire time, right from the beginning, right from when the gift giver came and said, hey, I want to give a gift to you of this crocodile. So immediately says, crocodile, I don't want a crocodile. The whole time, right from the beginning, he's saying, I don't want it. Then the gift does not transfer, even if he writes it and he throws it to him or gives it to him or something, it does not transfer. Whereas Shemuel was talking about in a case where the guy says, I want to give a gift to you, a crocodile, here you go, here's the deed. And at first, the recipient is quiet, he doesn't say anything. Only later, he starts screaming. So because at the beginning, he was quiet, that indicates that he agreed to it. And then later, he thought about it more, and he says, oh, crocodile, how am I going to feed it? What am I going to do? It's against the law. So then he realized afterwards that this is not a good gift, but it's too late. He already received it. Once it's his, that's it. It's his. And he would have to do another transfer to get rid of it, to give it to someone else, or to give it back. But once he has it, he has it. So there is, in fact, no controversy here. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Zika lo al yedei acher, v'shatak ulbasof savach, banu lemachloket Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel v'Rabbanan. Now, similar case, except we're adding a third party. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, let's say Reuven is the gift giver, and he wants to give something to Shimon, but he doesn't give it directly to Shimon like we had in the previous case. Instead, he gives it to Levi, and he tells Levi, listen, can you take this gift of this deed of gift on behalf of Shimon? Generally, that's permitted. A person can receive a positive thing on behalf of someone else. So that Levi can receive something on behalf of Shimon. So usually that would work. Now, what if in this case all three people are there? Reuven gives this thing to Levi and says, take this on behalf of Shimon. Shimon's on the other side of the room and sees what's going on. And he's quiet. At first he doesn't say anything. But then afterwards, a few minutes later, he starts screaming in protest, no, I don't want this item. Well, that case is slightly different from the previous one, and here it's dependent on a controversy between Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbanan, as we see in the following Baraita Detanya. הכותב נכסיו לאחר והיו בהן עבדים ואמר לה אי אפשי בהן אם היה רבן שני כהן הרי אלו אוכלים בתרומה. According to Tanakama, someone writes a document to someone else, writes a document of giving his property to someone else, and within his property there are slaves, and the recipient realizes there are slaves and says, I don't want them. He doesn't want slaves. Maybe he's anti-slavery, or maybe he just doesn't want to feed the slaves. He doesn't want to have to deal with it. So he says he doesn't want it. Now, if the second master, that means the recipient, is a Kohen, then those slaves can eat terumah. That's a fancy way of saying that the recipient gets it anyway. That's it. He accepted the gift, and the gift goes through, and even though he's arguing and he's protesting and saying, I don't want it, nevertheless, the gift is valid. Any family members or members of the household of a Kohen, including his slaves, can eat teruma. So in other words, the transfer goes through according to Tanna Kama. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Kevan Shamar Hala, Efshi Bahen, Kevar Zachu, Bahen Yorshin. Rashbag disagrees and says, since the recipient says, I don't want them, so that means that I don't want them means I don't want them. So they don't go to the recipient. Instead, they stay in the possession of the giver. And when that giver dies, then it will go to his heirs, and it never transfers. So here's machloket whether it transfers or not. Now, regarding that Baraita, b'havinan ba, v'Tanna Kama, filo med v'soveach, we wondered about Tanna Kama. Even if the recipient is standing and screaming, no, I don't want it, no, I don't want it, still we're going to say, oh, no, it's yours. You can't give something against a person's will. So Rashbag makes a lot more sense here. How can we explain Tanna Kama? Amar Ravavi Temar Rabbi Yochanan Besovech Mekaro Dekula Amala Pelige de la Kane Shatak Ubasov Savach Dekula Amala Pelige de Kane. Rava explains, and some say Rabbi Yochanan explains, if the recipient is shouting and protest the entire time, right from the beginning, as soon as this guy comes in and says, hey, I want to give you a gift of all my property, including some slaves, and the guy says, no way, I don't want it, then everyone would agree that it doesn't transfer. Of course not. And if he's quiet at first, I want to transfer all this stuff to you, and the guy accepts it, and he doesn't say anything, and only later, then he's making a calculation, oh, how much are they going to eat, how much are they going to work, what's my friend going to say, and he decides he doesn't want it. Then he said, and then he starts protesting. Too late. You already accepted it. It's already yours. You can't undo it afterwards. Everybody agrees to that as well. Ki pelige shezika lo al yedei acher v'shatak ulbasof savach. V'de Tanna Kama savar. Mid shatik kanin hu v'hai deka savach mihadar hu deka hadar be. The case where they disagree is where he used a third party. That's why we brought this whole thing, where the gift giver doesn't give it directly to the recipient, he gives it to a third party. And the recipient is present, and doesn't say anything at first, and only then protests. That makes it more complicated, and that is where the controversy is. Here's the two sides. Tanna Kama says, because he was quiet at first, he's watching this happen. He sees Reuven to give something to Shimon and says, take this on behalf of Levi. And Levi's standing there and he's quiet. That means he agrees to it. And the fact that he's screaming afterwards is because now he changed his mind and he wants to return it. And he wants to go back and undo what was done before. But it's too late. He can't do it anymore. ורבן שמעון בן גמליאל סבר, הוכיח סופו תחילתו, והיידלה סבך עד אשתא דסבר קילה מתוי לידי, מאי אסבך. Rashbag says, the screaming, the protest that he does at the end, proves his intent at the beginning. And why didn't he protest at the beginning when initially the owner gave it to the third party? Because the recipient thought, why should I start protesting if it didn't come into my possession yet? He's just sitting on the other side of the room. He sees this happening. He says, I'm not going to protest now from the other side of the room. I'll wait until the third party comes to me, and then when he comes to me, then I'll say, no, I don't want it. Because he figures that he can express himself later. Since he's not directly part of the initial transaction, he doesn't have to run in and stop it. By protesting afterwards, it shows that he never wanted it to begin with. He's not changing his mind. He was just saying, oh, I'll protest when they come to me. Well, I'm not going to protest now when they're still all the way over there doing their own thing. Of course I don't want it, but I'll protest at the appropriate time. And so that is the machloket between Tanna Kama and Rashbag in this case. תנו רבנן, שכי מרש אמר, תנו 200 זוז לפלוני, ו300 לפלוני, ו400 לפלוני, אין אומרים כל הקודם בשטר זוכה, לפיכך יעשה עליו שטר חוב, גובה מכולם. A very interesting Tosefta. If someone is on his deathbed and he says, give 200 zuz to Mr. A, and give 300 zuz to Mr. B, and give 400 zuz to Mr. C. So, what does that mean? Does he want them all given at the same time, or chronologically one after the other? So, and when he says this formulation, we do not say whoever is earlier in the document gets it first. It was the guy in his deathbed said this, and they wrote it down in a document as a will, which is perfectly legitimate. So, you might think that, well, let's say there's limited funds, right? He's giving here 200, 300, and 400. Let's say there's only 300 zoos altogether in this guy's property, and he dies. So we say, well, it says it Reuven first. So give Reuven all 200. And then who's next? Shimon says he gets 3. Well, there's only 100 left, so he gets 100. No, we do not say that. Rather, we divide it equally among the 3 people here, right? There's one that's supposed to get 200, 300, 400. If there's only 300 zoos in the whole estate, each of the recipients gets 100. They all get an equal amount. And then if there's more, then they'll all get a little more until the first guy gets 200, then he's full. And once he's full, then if there's more funds than that, we'll split that equally between the 300 and the 400 guy until the 300 guy gets full. And if there's still funds left over, then we give it to the 400 guy. So they all get paid at the same time. Therefore, let's say afterwards, the guy died. He said this, they wrote it down. The guy died, and they gave out all these funds, whatever was available. Let's say there was lots of funds available, and they all got the full amount. And later on, someone comes to collect a debt from the deceased, and he has a lien on that property that the deceased had. So he comes along and says, hey, you have to pay me. Now, they already gave out this stuff, but this guy has a prior claim to it. So now, who pays? The answer is they all pay equally. Let's say a guy comes and says, he owes me 300 zuz. So then, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi have to each give 100 zuz. Since they received the money at the same time, simultaneously, they have to pay also simultaneously. And so, if it's 600, they'll all give 200. And that means the 200 guy will have 0 left, but that's okay because he got paid at the same time as everybody else. If he's owed more than that, 700, then the 200 guy will be depleted, and then the other 2 will share the 50 of the rest of it that they had, of the rest of the last 100 that they have to pay, and so on. אבל אמר תנו 200 זוז לפלוני ואחריו לפלוני אומרים כל הקודם בשטר זוכה. But if the guy in his deathbed used a different language and said give 200 to Reuven, and after that give 300 to Shimon, and after that give 400 to Levi, in that case, since he said after him, then we follow the order, and we're going to give Reuven the full 200 and fill him up. If there's still funds available, then we start paying Shimon. But if not, then only Reuven gets. And then Shimon will keep filling up, and Levi will get his money last. לפיכך יעשה עליו שטר חוב גובה מן האחרון, אין לו גובה משלפניו, אין לו גובה משלפניו. Therefore, let's say the guy dies and he said this word, ואחריו, and let's say everybody get paid fully. And then someone comes and says, oh, I have an outstanding loan from that guy, and I have a prior lien on all the stuff that you got, on these gifts that you got. So then we pay from the last, has to pay first. In other words, Reuven, Shimon, Levi got 400, and the guy says, oh, I have a claim for 400 that I need to get paid. So the last guy, Levi, pays all 400 because he was the last one to collect. So his collection is lesser than the first guy's. So we take all that out. It would be the same as if the guy came to collect before it was divvied out, and so he took 400, and then there's only 500 left, so then only Reuven would get 200, Shimon would get 300, and Levi would get nothing. So say same thing here. Although we already gave it to Levi, he has to be the first one to pay out, and if the loan is for more than that, then we'll go to Shimon and he'll pay, and if it's still more money outstanding, only then we go all the way back to Reuven, who got the first 200. תנו רבנן, שכיב מרש אמר, תנו 200 זוז לפלוני, בני בכור כראוי לו, נותנן ונוטל את בכורתו. אם אמר בי בכורתו, ידו על עליונה, רצה נוטלן, רצה נוטל בכורתו. Someone on his deathbed, the people on deathbed, maybe sometimes they use language that is a bit ambiguous, and they die. We can't ask them to clarify. So if he says, give 200 zuz to this person, Reuven, my firstborn, as is appropriate for him. So he wants to give, it's not clear, does he want to give a gift to his firstborn in addition to the double portion that the firstborn will get? Or does he mean give 200 zuz and that will be the double portion that he gets? The ambiguity is this kara'ulo, as is appropriate to him. But does that mean as appropriate to him as a bechor, and therefore it takes the place of the double portion, or as appropriate to him because he's a good son, or because I like him a lot? So we're not sure what this means. So if he says this language, then the bechor can take the 200 and he also gets the double portion for that he gets as a firstborn. He gets both. So this 200 zuz does not replace the bechorah. However, if the guy dying says, give 200 zuz to Reuven, my firstborn, bibchorato, as his firstborn payment. In other words, that means it's instead of, this is the firstborn payment, then the firstborn can choose whatever he wants. He has the upper hand, Yado al Elyonah. If he wants to take the 200 zuz, he can. If he says, I don't want the 200 zuz, I want my Torah right of getting a double portion, he can do that. He can calculate which one is going to be more. And he can see, 200 zuz, that's more than double of everything in the estate. Okay, I'll take that. Or he can decide the other way around. So this language is true. The father said, give him this as his firstborn portion, but he could say, no, I don't want that. I want my firstborn portion. But he cannot get both in this case because the father said, give him 200 zuz as his firstborn portion. So he cannot get both. Whereas if he says kara'ulo, he gets both. Another similar case, Ushri Mera, Shamar tenu 200 zuz leplonit ishti kara'uila, notlan, notaltan, venotelet et ketubata. Guy in his deathbed says, give 200 zuz to Sarah, my wife, as is appropriate to her. In that case, she can take the 200 zuz and also collect her ketubah. Because here, kara'uila, what does that mean, kara'uila? Kara'uila as her ketubah doesn't necessarily mean that. It might mean kara'uila as is fitting for her because she's such a great wife and I really want to give her this gift. So therefore she can take this and also take the ketubah. Im amar bich tubata, but if he said, give 200 zuz to Sarah, my wife, as her marriage contract, that's the 200 zuz is, meaning instead of the marriage contract, then she can decide. Yadal Elyonah rasa notaltan, rasa notelet ketubata. Then she can decide, does she want to take the 200 zuz? She can. In fact, the standard ketubah for a betula, for a first-time marriage, is in fact 200 zuz. So in many cases it might be the same, but maybe she just says, okay, let's take this up front. Or she can say, no, I want the ketubah. The ketubah is often more than that. The 200 zuz is the minimum, but it could be that he added more money to it. And so she'll say, no, I don't want the 200 zuz, I want my ketubah. So she can decide whatever is in her interest to do. But she cannot collect both because he said, bich tubata. A last similar case, Ushri Mera Shamar, tenu 200 zuz leploni, Baal chovi kara'ui lo, notlan venotelet chobo. V'imamar bechovo, notlan bechovo. Someone on his deathbed says, give 200 zuz to Joe, the guy who I owe money to, as is fitting for him. So now it's not clear. When he says it's 200 zuz, does he mean to give Joe a gift? Maybe it's his friend. I want to give him an extra gift. Or does he mean kara'ui lo, as is appropriate for him, as a creditor, because I owe him money? So when he says just kara'ui lo, then Joe can collect the 200 zuz, and he can also collect the full amount of the outstanding loan. But if he said the same language, but instead said bechovo, he says, give him 200 zuz to Joe, my creditor, for my debt. Well, in that case, it's meant only for the debt, and so that 200 zuz will go to Joe and as repayment of the debt or whatever outstanding amount. It will reduce the outstanding amount by that 200 zuz. Good. That's the end of the baraita. Now we ask about it. Mishum damar kara'ui lo notlan venotel et hobo. Wait a second. In this last case, just because the guy on his deathbed said, as is appropriate to him, Joe should be able to collect the 200 zuz and also collect the outstanding loan? How could you do that? Right? Maybe he meant that, but maybe he didn't mean that. Maybe what he meant is, as is appropriate for him as my debtor, for the debt. And that's what he meant. Let Joe prove that he meant otherwise. So how can we assume that the guy in his deathbed meant he wants to give an extra gift in addition to the loan? Amar Rav Nachman, Amar li Huna, Hamaneh, Rabbi Akiva hi, dedayek li shana yetera. Rav Nachman says that Rav Huna told him, who is the author of this baraita? It is Rabbi Akiva, who learns things from extra language. According to Rabbi Akiva, this is true for Rabbi Akiva's approach to Midrash on the Torah. Anytime the Torah has an extra vav, an extra et, a double language, anything extra, he says, must be for an important reason to teach us an extra halacha. Whereas Rabbi Ishmael, his colleague, says, no, dibra Torah kilshon bnei adam, sometimes you have an et because you just need it grammatically in order to introduce the next word. Sometimes you have double language because that's the way people speak. That's normal language to emphasize something, and you don't learn anything from it. Rabbi Akiva says this not only about the Rashot in Pesukim, but also in parsing the legal language. When someone says something, if someone on his deathbed, that's legal language, and we have to parse it. What did he mean exactly? And if someone says extra words like kara'ui lo, so Rabbi Ishmael might say, people just say kara'ui lo, they don't really mean anything by it. They mean as appropriate to him because I like him, but it has no legal significance. Rabbi Akiva says no. If the guy on his deathbed adds extra words they didn't have to say, then he must intend to add something extra, some extra payment. So if he intended only that he wants to give 200 zuz towards his balance, then he could have left out kara'ui lo and says, give 200 zuz to Joe, who I owe money to. That's it, just stop. And if the fact that he's adding as is appropriate to him, those extra words must mean must have legal significance. What is the legal significance? That he wants it to be a gift in addition to the outstanding loan. Now, how do we see that Rabbi Akiva learned something from extra words? Di tanan. We have it in the Mishnah, in this very Masechet. Velo tabor velo tadut. Af al pi shekatav lo umka v'numa, v'sarich likach lo derech divrei Rabbi Akiva. If someone sells a house without specifying what exactly is included, then he gets the house, he gets the living space of the house, but he will not get the pit or the cistern that's in the house, because that's not technically part of the living space in the house. It just has to be a cistern that is in the house. And even if he writes in the document of sale, I'm selling you its depth and its height, that only means that he's selling the basement, the first floor, the third floor, the attic. It means selling all the living space of all the floors. That's true. But the cistern is not part of the living space of the house, and therefore it does not go through with the sale. However, even though the seller keeps the cistern, the seller will have to buy back a path to get to the cistern, because he's going to have to go into the house, go down to the basement in order to get water from the cistern. Because he sold the house, so that's it. The entire house is sold, including all of the walking space. So therefore the seller, although he owns the cistern, he has to buy a right to get to the cistern, according to Rabbi Akiva. Chachamim omerim, eno sarich likach lo derech. Chachamim say, no, he doesn't have to buy a path because he keeps the cistern, so it's assumed that if he's keeping the cistern, he also keeps a path to get to it. Rabbi Akiva agrees with Rabbanan that if he added extra words and he said, I'm selling you the house, and he explicitly left out and said, except for the cistern and the pit. If he adds extra words, then he does not have to buy back a path towards it. Why not? Because these extra words must have some legal effect. Now, if you say that when you sell it without saying anything, the seller keeps the cistern, and if you add these words, he also keeps the cistern. So what's the point of adding these words? It must be that adding these words comes to add some legal significance. And what is that? When he says, except for the cistern, that adds on that the seller is keeping the path towards the cistern. So we see, Alma, kevan de la sirich ka'amar, letafuyem milata ka'ate. So you see in this case, since he didn't have to say the words chus me'elu in order to exclude the cistern, the seller keeps the cistern automatically. So he didn't have to say it. So why does he say it? It must be he had intention that he wanted to add something to the matter. He wanted to add, not only am I keeping the cistern, I'm also keeping a path, so he doesn't have to buy it back. And here also, since he didn't have to say kara'ui lo, he could have just said, give 200 zuz to Joe, my creditor. Why did he add the extra words, as is appropriate to him? It must mean that he wants to add something to the matter. So it has legal significance. So what is that? It means he wants to add 200 zuz more as a gift in addition to repayment of the loan. תנו רבנן, שכי מרש אמר, מנה יש לי אצל פלוני, העדים כותבין אף על פי שאין מכירין. If someone is on his deathbed and he says, that guy owes me money. He wants people to know before he dies that guy owes him money so that the heirs will be able to go and collect it. So there are witnesses that are listening to everything that the guy in his deathbed says, and they're writing it down. Just like when the guy in his deathbed says, I want to give $100 to this guy, so they write it down in a will. So they also can write down, oh, so-and-so owes the deceased this amount of money. Now, they can write this down even if the witnesses themselves don't know if this is true. They're not sure. They weren't there. They don't know. They're not sure if this is true. Nevertheless, they can write it down in that will and sign it. Therefore, when the heirs come to actually collect the money, they have to bring outside evidence. They cannot use the will as evidence. They can't say, look, the will says that you owed my father $100, and see there's witnesses on it. That means it's true. You have to pay. No, it's not true. Because the witnesses, they just write it down. They're just witnessing that the deceased said that. That's all they're testifying to. And therefore, the heirs will have to bring other confirmation, other witnesses, a deed, a loan document, something that says that in fact they owe money. That's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Hachamim omrim en kotvin elim ken makirin. Leficha keshu gobe en tzarich labi re'aya. Hachamim say that the witnesses may not write down so-and-so owes this guy in his deathbed money unless they know it to be true. Therefore, since they're only going to write it if they themselves witnessed it and know it to be true, therefore, if they do write it, then when the heirs come to collect, they don't have to bring any other proof. They could just bring the will itself because the witnesses on it are testifying to the truth of the matter. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar li Huna, Tana, Rabbi Meir omer en kotvin, Chamim omrim kotvin. Rav Nachman says that Huna told him that there is a Braita that has the same opinions but switched around. That is Rabbi Meir who says the witnesses may not write it unless they recognize know that it's true. And Chachamim are the ones that said, just write it. You're only writing what you hear, and you're not testifying to the truth of the matter, and therefore they can write anything. So it's switched around. Now, in this version, we have another further explanation of Rabbi Meir. V'af Rabbi Meir lo amar ela mishum betin to'in. Why did Rabbi Meir say that the witnesses cannot write down something that they don't know to be true? Rabbi Meir says because we worry about a court that makes an error. A proper court should always look into a matter and make sure, even though it's on this will, and they should say, wait, these witnesses, did they actually know it, or are they only reporting what they heard from the deceased? So if all courts were proper, then Rabbi Meir says, I would agree in principle that that the witnesses could write it. So Rabbi Meir says, I agree in principle that the Chachamim are correct, and really, witnesses to a will are just testifying, we heard the deceased on his deathbed say this. And anything that he says that he's going to give as a gift automatically is true because whatever he says, we do. do. And so they're just writing a report, and a proper bet din, well, we can make sure that they will check into the matter and see if those witnesses really knew it to be true or only reporting, and then they need other proof. So the Bimei says, you know why I say don't let the witnesses write anything? Because I'm afraid of incompetent courts. Not every court is the same. You go to some other village or somewhere else, and there's a court there that doesn't know the law so well, and they may just take this will and assume that it's true. And therefore, we tell all witnesses, only write it down in the will if you know it to be true. Amar Rav Dimi midar de'ah, hilcheta en choshishin lebet din to'in. Rav Di from Dada says, we don't have to worry about courts that make mistakes. We have to assume that courts know what they're doing. And that, therefore, halacha would be like chachamim, that the witnesses can write down, so-and-so on his deathbed told us that some guy owes him $100. And we testify that the guy said this on his deathbed. And every court will know, oh, they're only testifying that he said that. They're not testifying that they know it's true, and so we don't have to worry about a bet din that doesn't know what they're doing. Umay shena midrava de'amar Rava en chosin ela im ken makirin ve'en mema'anin ela im ken makirin lefichach kotvin get chalisa ve'get mi'un ve'af al pi she'en makirin. And now we ask, how is this conclusion that you don't worry about a bet din that makes a mistake? How is that different from the ruling of Rava? He said this in Yevamot, and it's accepted over there. That Rava said, well, we should not perform chalitza, a bet din should not perform chalitza, unless the judges themselves recognize the people involved. You can't have two random people come into a court that the court doesn't recognize. They just see them for the first time. Some woman comes and says, oh, my husband died and we have no children, and this is my brother-in-law and I want to do chalitza. And the judges are just going to do it, but they don't know who these people are. Are they who they say they are? So that would be improper. So Rava says a bet din should only do chalitza if they actually recognize the people. They know them from before. Or there's other people testifying, this is who she says she is. And furthermore, to do mi'un, if a minor girl was married, she has the right, married off by her older brother or by her mother. Her father died. If her father's alive, the father could marry her off mideoraita, that's a full marriage. But if the father's not alive and the mother or older brother marry her off, then it's a conditional marriage, and she can protest before she becomes an adult. And she says, I don't want to be married to this guy, and then that marriage is null and void. But you have to do that in a court. If some random person comes to the court and says, I want to protest my marriage, but they only will accept it if they know who she is. Therefore, another court, let's say that there's witnesses that see the chalitza in the first court. They go over to another court and they say, oh, we testify that this person, they had chalitza done in the first court. So the second court can write a get chalitza or get mi'un. That's a document that affirms that indeed this person did chalitza or this person did mi'un, and therefore she can get remarried, even if the witnesses do not recognize the people themselves. They say, listen, I don't know their names, but these are the people, we saw them in court. The second court can accept it because we assume that the first court did the proper job and made sure they recognized who these people are, they are who they say they are, and that this person really is in need of a chalitza, and they checked out everything that's required. Since the first court, that we're dealing with people that move around, and so they live in one place and then they're moving to another place and they want to get remarried in the second place. And so then the court has to look into a second place. So how are they going to know if the first court did it? Based on witnesses. How can you trust the witnesses? So Rava is basically saying like this: the first court that actually does the ceremony, they have to know who the people are, check everything out. So as long as they do that, and then witnesses see this person did a chalitza, and they testify about that to the second court can rely on the proper ceremony being done in the first court and proper identification. That's what Rava said. Now, what are Rava's assumptions? My ta'ama la mishum dechoshishin lebet din to'in is what's the reason that Rava says that the first court has to make sure that they identify the people. Is it not because we worry about a court that errs? We worry that if the first court doesn't do it, the second court, who actually writes up the document, will make a mistake. That the second court will say, oh, the witnesses said you did it, fine, we'll write it up. And they're not going to check. So why do you need the first court to make sure to check who the people are? Because the second court, who really should be the ones checking who the people are, because they're actually writing the document, we're afraid that they won't, and that's why you need the first court. Anyway, this contradicts the conclusion we said here. Rav Dimi ben Hada'ah said we don't worry about a court that makes a mistake, but Rava's ruling assumes that we do worry that the second court will not look into the matter properly, and that's why the first court cannot do a ceremony unless they check the identities first. So now we have a problem. How do we solve this contradiction? We answer, La bedina batar bedina la daiki, bedina batar adim daiki. No, in fact, it depends. The second court depends what they're relying on. A second court will not check a first court, because courts usually are good and courts will trust each other. So indeed, the second court is not going to examine the activities of the first court, because they'll assume that the first court was competent, which hopefully they are. So when the second court hears from witnesses that this certain person did chalitza in the first court, so then they can and should be able to trust that the first court looked into the matter, and therefore they can rely on these witnesses that these are really the people. That explains Rava. However, the original law that we were talking about, where a guy is on his deathbed, and two witnesses say, we heard this guy say that someone owes him money, there a bet din is always going to re-examine what the witnesses say. Just because witnesses said it, well, witnesses could be anybody. They could be very trustworthy people. They could be people that are not so trustworthy. So just because witnesses wrote this down, no court's going to trust those witnesses to mean that they know it's true. Maybe they're only writing down the fact that they heard it. So we don't have to worry that there's going to be a court that's going to mistake testimony in a will to mean that it's definitely true that that person owes money. Any court, and we assume courts are competent, and that's the statement above that Rav Dimi ben Hada'ah says. We assume that a court is competent to check the testimony of witnesses in a will to make sure that they're not just writing down what they heard, but that they know that it's actually true. They're going to check it no matter what. So therefore, we don't have to worry about the witnesses themselves. The witnesses can write down something, even though they don't know it's true, because the bet din will make sure to check into it that this person really owes money. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.